It's so good to see all of you here tonight. And I'm really excited to be here, and I'm just really honored that I've been asked to talk to you about suffrage, race, and power. And actually, that's also the topic that we're exploring for the entire year in the Office of Engagement for Women and the Philadelphia Commission for Women, because this is the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And we thought it was a good time to explore that, especially since while we're talking about the 19th Amendment, there were so many Black women whose stories are untold in that movement to get the right to vote. And so we thought that it would be a good time for us to bring up their names and their stories and what they did for the right to vote. And so I'm really honored to sort of, thank you. And that was Nina Ahmed. And Dr. Ahmed was the one that hired me to be in the Office of Engagement for Women and the Philadelphia Commission for Women. And so I'm grateful to her, and she's a candidate. So, everyone who knows me, my boss, Gina, my new boss, Gina, that was my old boss, this is the new boss, knows that I talk a lot. And I have an opinion about everything. I'm also grateful, though, that I have, but you get like that. If you grew up in a house with 6 sisters, you'd talk a lot, and you'd be loud like I am, and you'd have an opinion about everything. Oh, and you'd be competitive about your opinion because you have 6 other people who have an opinion too, and if you don't speak up, you don't get heard. So, I speak up so I can be heard. So, as I proceed, I better put on my glasses. So, in many ways, serving in the public is a trifecta. When you run for public office, it brings together our voices, our votes, and our power. And what we're really talking about this evening is actually power. You are powerful, your vote is powerful, and your voice is powerful. And what we also want to talk about when we talk about power is how to use it, how to keep it, and for whom. So as I approach the subject of suffrage, race, and power, I think it's necessary to provide some context about who I am and the lived experiences that have shaped me. I came of age when there was a convergence of the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, the Black nationalist movement, the women's movement, the reproductive rights movement, and the anti-war movement. And all of those movements were happening at a time, and it was happening in real time, and they all captured my attention and my passion. So, and they were all social justice movements, and they provided some very powerful examples of how ordinary people could do extraordinary things. And they changed the world, and they changed my world. And also, I saw that ordinary people, young people just like me, were inspired just like me. And that inspiration, that thirst for social justice still stays with me today. And it inspires the work that I do in the Mayor's Office of Engagement for Women. It also sets the agenda for the work of the Philadelphia Commission for Women. I was an eyewitness to young people who sacrificed their lives to work in the Jim Crow South, to register Black people to vote. These were young people who demonstrated and agitated to get a Civil Rights Act of 1964 and a Voting Rights Act of 1965. I know the power of the ballot box, and I've watched the pendulum swing from the power of the vote to expand rights and to be equally powerful to dismantle them. I remain a true believer in a democracy that is stronger and is at its best when it expands rights. And hopefully, I will get to be an eyewitness when finally the Equal Rights Amendment will finally get passed. I was 14 years old when I volunteered for my first presidential campaign. I knocked on doors and I stuffed envelopes for the anti-war candidate. I demonstrated in support of Bobby Kennedy's legislation for a constitutional amendment that would grant 18-year-olds the right to vote. And it was at the height of the Vietnam War, and there was a military draft at the time, and our thinking was that if 18-year-olds could fight and die for their country, damn it, 18-year-olds should be old enough to vote for the leaders that sent them there. So in 1972, I was among the first of the 18-year-olds that gained the right to vote. And in that same year, in the primary, Shirley Chisholm, whose slogan was "Unbought and Unbossed," ran for president, paving the way for other women of color to dare to believe that they too could be president, including Carol Moseley Braun, Cynthia McKinney, and Kamala Harris. 1972 was also the year that Bella Abzug and Patsy Takemoto Mink put their hats in the ring to run for president. Mink was the first Asian American to dare to compete, leading the way for Andrew Yang and Kamala Harris. And here we are 100 years since the 19th Amendment, 48 years since 1972, and we've yet to elect a woman president. And that saddens me. A couple weeks ago, I attended a program that explored the likability question. Okay? And women who had run for office were asked about the stereotypes and the bigotry they faced and the challenges. And sometimes those questions about likability, they aren't coming from men. Sometimes those questions about likability are coming from us. Okay? And so if we're over 51% of the population, and our percentage is even higher when it comes to registered voters, we ought to be able to do something about that. So let's look at a couple of key races that brings into clear focus the role of race and gender in politics. For example, 96% of Black women voted for Hillary Clinton, and 54% of white women voted for her opponent. And as recently as the Democratic primaries, we watched a diverse field of presidential candidates, only to see that the last candidates standing are two old white men. And so I'm reminded of Helen Ubinis. Her column last week had the headline, quote, "We sure love diversity as long as white dudes stay in power." She quoted actress June Diane Raphael, who tweeted, quote, "Stop telling your daughters they can be president when you are unwilling to vote for a woman president," unquote. We also know that Stacey Abrams would be the governor of Georgia if it were not for the 75% of white women who voted for her opponent. So I think our conversation today is extremely important, and it's not an easy conversation, but it's a necessary conversation. It's complicated. The antecedents for this complicated and uncomfortable conversation began over 400 years ago, when the first enslaved people landed on the shores of Virginia in 1619. This complicated and uncomfortable conversation continued when enslaved people were counted as 3/5 of a person. This complicated and uncomfortable conversation continued when Abigail Adams encouraged her husband, John Adams, to, quote, "remember the ladies." But as we know, the ladies were not remembered and were excluded from the Constitution with no guaranteed voting rights or property rights. The complication continues today On the one hand, we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment when women earned the right to vote. We celebrate the women whose courage and persistence led to the passage of the 19th Amendment. But at the same time, we must challenge as racist the white suffragettes who intentionally erased and marginalized the black women who were also suffragettes. But it was not just the 19th Amendment that they fought for. They also fought for the right of the 15th Amendment that granted black men the right to vote. So for black women, universal suffrage has always been as a human right, not just a woman's right or a black man's right, but a human right. So it's often said that history belongs to those who write it. So to commemorate the anniversary of the 19th Amendment, the Philadelphia Commission for Women, along with partners that includes Women's Way, New Century Trust, and Johnson House Historic Site, are committed to bringing out of the shadows and into the light the black women who were instrumental in passing the 19th Amendment and who worked unheralded to secure the right to vote for women. Many of them were Philadelphians, and they included Mary Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and the Fortin family, Harriet, Charlotte, Margaretta Fortin. And on the national stage, there were women like Ida B. Wells, Sojourner Truth, Mary Church Terrell, and Anna Julia Cooper. Their names are as important as Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Alice Paul. Anna Julia Cooper, who was a suffragette, and she was a feminist writer, said, "Only the black woman can say when and where I enter in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood without violence and without suing or special patronage. Then and there, the whole race enters with me." And for me, that quote summarizes how different gender equality is for black women. Because basically, it's not about just our womanhood, it's about our entire race. And so we are committed to having this difficult conversation about intersectional feminism. That is to say that we recognize and we value the multiple experiences that black and brown women bring to how we experience gender inequality. We also embrace the fairness of a human rights agenda that values gender equity over gender equality. The two are not the same. Equity means fair treatment, and it means the allocation of resources, and fair allocation of resources rather, as opposed to equal allocation of resources. And for this discussion, it means that equitable is accepting the authenticity of women candidates for who they are, and not necessarily those criteria and how we judge them should not necessarily be the same as we judge women, as men, I'm sorry. Men and women are different, and we need to acknowledge the differences that we bring to leadership, whether it's in the boardroom, the governor's mansion, or the White House. Our experiences as women are inextricably tied to our multiple experiences. We don't all experience gender inequality the same way. For black women and women of color, gender inequality is viewed through the lens of our blackness. That includes age, disability, gender identity, marital status, education, income, and even zip code. And so when I say that we need to expand how we view gender inequality, I'm suggesting that gender equity is a way of looking at our place in the world, in politics and in society, and start looking at it as gender justice. One of the ways we are exploring gender justice is by hosting Brave Spaces conversations. And the first one will be Trust Black Women, Changing the Narrative in Philanthropy. We want to bring together black women who are executive directors of nonprofits with philanthropists to explore the underfunding of organizations headed by black women. And another one of our Brave Spaces conversations will be around the topic of campaign staffing. How many of you were volunteers on campaigns? I want to see a show of hands. And how many of you got paid? But I bet you there were men on those campaign staffs, and the men were getting paid and the women were volunteers. And I've seen it time and time again. I'm sure you've seen it too, where the people who get paid are men, but the women are these really hardworking volunteers. Well, we want to have a conversation to change that dynamic, because we have to change how we view women. We have to change how we view the work that women do, and to value it and put some dollar signs around that value. And those are the kinds of things that will at least address the gender wage gap. We are committed to being unapologetic about acknowledging that gender equity and racial equity are inextricably tied. We are committed to imagining a multiracial civic engagement with all who embrace the transformative leadership of Black women, the alignment with women of color, and the partnership of progressive white women and others of goodwill who collectively uphold the power of gender equity in the quest for true democracy. History belongs to those who write it, and I'm asking that we write a new chapter. I'm asking that we come together for a woman-led, united front, for not just sustained conversation around gender and race justice, but a plan of action that acknowledges that if we are truly committed to recruiting more women to run for public office and giving them the resources to win, we must also acknowledge that our collective imperative is to collectively disrupt and dismantle white privilege and white supremacy. Thank you.